I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, and you're watching this because you're probably curious, or maybe you even own one of our Vertex buffer interfaces or modules. They're the exact same thing, only the enclosures that they're in are different. One of them is designed to go on any pedal board, that's the Vertex buffer interface, and then the Vertex buffer module is designed specifically for our Vertex pedal boards. What I'm going to do today is take you through all of the different diagrams that we've established as known and approved ways to route your signal using our Vertex buffer interface and/or module. So we're going to start from the simplest, from just the straight mono rigs, and then we're going to work our way up into the more complicated wet-dry or wet-dry-wet rigs. There will be a table of contents in chapters here so that you can skip around to find what you want. But the one thing to know is that there is a QR code on every one of our buffer modules and interfaces that you can scan at any time, and it will take you to a section of the website where we are constantly compiling and refining all the different wiring diagrams and guides. So you can always use that as a reference to get back to where you might see a visual representation of that if we're moving a little too fast here in terms of the pacing of the various diagrams. And we'll have that linked in the description as well for you to reference at any time. Another thing to name is that we are just coming up with fictitious signal paths here. They roughly follow the rules of what you would expect to see in the majority of signal paths, but this is by no means a thing to follow religiously. You can always, of course, email us or put a comment down below if you want us to help guide you through your individual signal path to make sure that you're wiring this in the proper way to get the result that you want. So the mono signal path is the simplest of them. The guitar is going into the pedal board, and the pedal board is going into the input of the amp. Let's walk through this diagram. So the guitar comes in to the guitar input on the interface. Then, straight across from that, goes out of the output. It feeds the tuner, the overdrive, the boost, the modulation, which we've used a chorus here to represent, then feeds the delay, then the reverb, and then goes back into the interface on the input left. That goes through to amp left, which then feeds back to the input of amplifier 1. So that was mono. Now let's move to the next kind of level up, which would be split mono, which is basically a mono signal that gets split out to 2 amps. So not stereo, both amps are receiving the same exact mono signal, but this is typically referred to as either split mono or just a split output signal. So in the split mono or dual mono wiring, it's pretty much the exact same thing. Guitar comes into the guitar input on the interface. Out of the interface straight across goes to tuner, overdrive, boost, chorus, then goes to delay, then reverb, then back to the interface, input left, out of amp left goes to amp 1, out of amp right goes into the input of amp 2. You'll notice here on the interface that there's only one input into input left, but both amp right output and amp left output are activated. That is because when you only have one input plugged in to the input left and not in the input right, it automatically splits the signal and sends that input from input left to both amp right and amp left. So you can have 2 amps available. Of course, the isolated output will be amp right. So that was the signal path for a split mono or dual mono system. Let's now upgrade to the next level, which is the stereo system, running 2 amplifiers in stereo. So in the stereo system, the guitar comes in again to the instrument input, the guitar input, goes out, feeds the tuner, overdrive, boost, chorus, delay, and reverb. Now, both those delay and reverbs are run in stereo, so they have both left and rights activated. The right side of the reverb goes into input right on the buffer interface. The left side of the output of the reverb goes to input left on the buffer interface. And then the amp left, which is the output left, feeds amp 1 input, and amp right, which is the output from the right, feeds amp 2. So these are both feeding the amplifiers, and again, the isolated output is amp right. There is a polarity switch assigned to that so that you can ensure that both of these amps are in phase with each other. So that was a stereo rig. Now let's move on to something that you could utilize with either a stereo or a mono rig. This is the use of an audition loop. You'll notice in both of the diagrams that we just showed you for the mono and stereo setup that there's nothing plugged into those send and return jacks that are in the middle of the interface. These can be used for a multitude of things. The send jack is passive, so it can be used for either a foot switch, an amp foot switch if you have one on the board. It can be run as TS or TRS. This also ensures that it could work with MIDI if you wanted to go MIDI to TRS and use it as a MIDI through. This could also be used as a passive input if you have some impedance-sensitive devices that you wanted to plug into, so you could use that send as the input to the entire system and then catch that input buffer a little bit later down the chain. Multiple uses for it. What I'm going to talk to you about now is how to use it as an audition loop. Not only as a mono audition loop for mono pedals, but how to use it as a stereo audition loop, where you can run a stereo pedal into it and come back in stereo and feed other stereo devices after it. So let's start first with the mono audition loop. So the guitar comes into the interface in the guitar input. It goes out, feeds that tuner, feeds the overdrive, feeds the chorus. But instead of just going to the next pedal in the signal path, let's say like the delay, it would go back into the interface and hit the return. The return is an output. So we're going to feed into the return, and that's going to output to the input of your audition pedal, your pedal off the board that you're wiring in between the modulation section and the wet reverb and delay section. This could be put anywhere you want, but just for the purposes of the diagram, we've shown it in this particular way. So the return is going to feed the input of the audition pedal. The output of the audition pedal is going to come back into the interface send. This is just with a mono cable TS. And then the send is going to come back in and feed the input of the delay and the reverb. And the reverb and delay, if in mono, are just going to feed the left side into the in left amp left of the interface and then feed one of the amps, amp one. And if it was in stereo that you wanted to go after your audition loop, then of course the right side out of that reverb would feed the input right on the interface, and then amp right would feed the input of amp two, so you'd have your stereo amps. But now let's talk about if you had a stereo effect that you wanted to run in the audition loop. The way that you would do that is exactly the same way. Guitar comes into the guitar input, it's that input buffer, goes out, feeds the tuner, feeds the overdrive, feeds the boost, feeds the chorus. The chorus is still going to feed into the return. That return is then going to go out into the input of that stereo device, so it's coming in mono. And then the output of that stereo device is going to go out in stereo. So both sides are going to be active coming into that send. But here's one thing that you need to do. You're going to need to use either an insert cable or an adapter that converts a TRS into two TS, two mono plugs that's going to feed into that input side of the send. Equally, when you get to the other side of the send, you're going to need that same type of insert cable, which is going to begin as a TRS and then break out into two mono TS cables to feed the stereo input of the delay. This can be easily purchased from our website on therigdr.com. We make custom TRS insert cables, but also there are plenty of companies like HOSA that make pigtail adapters that would do this very same thing fairly inexpensively. So you can check it out either way. So from the send, again, it's going to break out in from a TRS to two TS. It's going to feed the input of the delay left and right with those two mono cables for left and right. Then that's going to feed stereo into the reverb. And then the stereo out of the reverb left side is going to feed in left. And then amp left is going to feed amp one. And then again, out of the other side of the stereo reverb, output right is going to feed in right on the buffer interface. And then amp right is going to feed into amp two. And that again is the isolated output that has the polarity switch so that you can ensure both amps are in phase. And that's going to give you the audition loop either in mono or stereo, depending on the type of device that you run. One thing that I should mention about the audition loops is that when you don't have anything wired into them, they do not automatically close the loop. So you will need to use a patch cable to bridge the send and return when nothing is wired into it. Now that we've done audition loops, let's now go into 4-cable and 5-cable method rigs. Let's start first with 4-cable, which is basically just a fancy way of saying you have an amplifier that has an effects loop. So simple again, guitar comes into the interface, goes into the guitar input. Out of that, it feeds the tuner. From the tuner, it feeds the overdrive. From overdrive, it feeds boost. Into boost, it feeds chorus. Now, for some people, this could be controversial. You might put modulation in the effects loop, but just bear with me again. This is just a model for a possible wiring. It isn't the truth. From the chorus, we're then going to go into the input of the front of the amp. So the way that we're going to do that is going out of the chorus into input left on the buffer interface, out of amp left in the buffer interface, hitting the input of your amp, going right into the front of the amp. Then from the amp, we're going to go out of the effects loop send, and that's going to feed the send on the buffer interface. It's going to go straight through, hit the input of the delay. Delay is going to hit the reverb, and then out of the reverb, it is going to go into the return jack. Return is then going to feed the effects return of the amplifier. So you have all of the wet effects minus the chorus wired into the effects loop, and then all the other effects in front of the amplifier. Now moving on to 5-cable method, really the only difference between 4-cable and 5-cable is that you're running stereo amps with effects loops. So the only thing that really changes is just those wet pedals are going to be returning to 2 different amplifier effects returns as opposed to 1. But let's walk through it from the beginning. So guitar comes into the guitar input on the Vertex buffer interface. Out of that, it feeds the tuner. The tuner then feeds the overdrive. The overdrive then feeds the boost. The boost then feeds the chorus. The chorus output is going to feed the interface box in the input left, and then amp left is going to feed the input of amp 1. This is going to be the primary amp. The send out of amp 1 is going to go back into the interface, into the send. Send is going to feed the input on the delay in mono. Then it's going to break out to stereo from there. Stereo out of the delay into reverb. Stereo out of the reverb. The left side is going to feed the return of amp 1. The right side, amp right, is going to feed the return of amp 2. You'll notice in amp 2, there is nothing plugged into the input and nothing plugged into the send because we're only utilizing the power amp section of the second amp, the stereo amp. It is not advisable to ever run into the front of both amps if you're going to be using the effects loop from both amps. There's a myriad of reasons why not to do this. Phasing and polarity being one of them, but also channel switching can become a real nightmare if you're trying to do it simultaneously. The best practice is running them in the fashion that I've shown you here, where you're utilizing 2 power amps, but only 1 preamp section from the main amp. So that is how you do 4-cable and 5-cable method. But one thing that some people ask is what happens if I've wired my rig for 4 or 5-cable method, which is using amplifiers with an effects loop, and then I need to consolidate to an amplifier that doesn't have an effects loop, and I still want to run all those effects, but put them in front of 1 amp, either in mono or stereo. So we're going to go through the signal path. So we start with the guitar. Guitar goes into the guitar input on the buffer interface. Out of that feeds the tuner, the overdrive, the boost, the chorus. The output of the chorus feeds into in left. And then out of amp left, instead of going into the amplifier input as we normally would in 4-cable method, we're going to feed into the send. So we're going to have a small patch cable that bridges amp left to send on that very same side. And then send already is wired to feed the input of the delay, the reverb, and then out of the reverb goes the return. So return is now going to become our output to the input of amp 1, which is going to put those wet effects all in series with everything else. And again, we just have that short patch cable that is bridging amp left into the send on that very same side. Now, equally with 5-cable method, we can do the same thing. We can take a 5-cable method, setup, and consolidate it to 2 stereo amps, everything in front. So let's go through the setup. Guitar comes into the guitar input. Out of that output, it's going to feed the tuner, the overdrive, the boost, the chorus. The chorus is going to feed into in left. And then again, amp left, instead of feeding into the input of the amp, it's going to go with a short patch cable from amp left to send. Then send is going to feed into the input of the delay. Stereo out of the delay is going to feed stereo into reverb. Stereo out of reverb is going to feed to amp right for the right side, and that's going to feed 1 amplifier input. And then the return is going to have the other side, the left side, and that's going to feed amp 1 on the input. So again, almost exact same thing as we saw converting 4-cable to 2-cable method, and really easy way to facilitate that so that you don't have to rip everything apart. It's just adding that one short patch cable, which is just basically bridging the effects that were formerly in the effects loop to in front of the amplifier. Let's now go to wet-dry rigs and wet-dry-wet rigs. These are ostensibly the same as what you just saw in terms of the routing for the 4 and 5 cable methods, with the exception that we're no longer going to be using the send, and instead we're going to be using a line out box, and some amplifiers may even have a line out built in, a Soldano SLO being an example of that. But let's walk through the signal path for a wet-dry rig. So guitar comes into the guitar input on the interface. From the output of the interface, it feeds the tuner, feeds the overdrive, feeds the boost, feeds the chorus. The chorus then goes into input left on the buffer interface. Out of the amp left, it's going to feed the input of your dry amp. Then from your dry amp, you are not going to be using the effects loop here, but instead you're going to be connecting to what's called a line out box. A really great one that I love is made by John Suhr, and I think it's just called the Suhr line out box or ISO line out box. In essence, this is going to tap off of the output transformer of your amplifier. You're going to connect your speaker cable from the speaker in the amp to this, and then another speaker cable is going to connect from the line out box to the back of the amplifier where the speaker was originally plugged in. And then it gives you this just regular 1/4-inch instrument line out that has a volume control on it, and maybe even isolation on it if you're going to use something high quality like the Suhr. That line out box then feeds the send on the buffer interface. The send then feeds the input of your delay. Delay then feeds the reverb, and the output of the reverb is going to go into the return on the buffer interface, and then the return is going to feed either the return of an amplifier with an effects loop or some sort of power amp that then feeds a cabinet for the wet processing effects. Now, this is simplifying it to a degree because in a real wet-dry-wet rig, you'd have mixers involved, but I'm just showing you the basic signal path so that you understand how you would utilize the routing to achieve that. The mixer would be happening on the pedalboard side anyway, so I'm not factoring that in as a consideration of how you might plug things in. This is just how you would plug things in terms of where it fits into the interface. But now let's upgrade this to a wet-dry-wet version, which is ostensibly the same thing, but using stereo effects in the wet path. But we'll go through it from the beginning. So guitar comes in to the buffer interface, into the guitar input. Out of that, it feeds the tuner, feeds the overdrive, feeds the boost, feeds the chorus. The chorus goes into input left on the buffer interface. Then amp left goes into the input of amp 1. Again, your dry amplifier here. You're then connecting your line out box between the amplifier and the speaker. It's giving you a line level output with a volume control that you're feeding into the send on the buffer interface. That send then feeds the input in mono to your delay pedal and then splits out in stereo from the delay into the reverb and then stereo out of the reverb. The left side of the stereo reverb is going to feed the return on the buffer interface. That return is going to feed either an effects loop return or the input of a stereo power amp. The right output from the reverb is going to feed in right on the buffer interface, and then amp right is going to then feed either a stereo power amplifier and feeding the other channel, or it's going to feed the return of another amp with an effects loop, and that's going to give you your stereo image for the wet, and then you have that dry in the center that has the line out attached to it. That's how you would run and wire our buffer interface for a wet-dry-wet rig. Now let's talk about impedance-sensitive pedals and how you would wire those. Now, there's two different ways that you can do it. The simplest way would be just to wire those devices straight after the guitar. So guitar would come in and it would feed whatever your impedance-sensitive devices are. In this case, we're showing a fuzz, and then the fuzz would feed the input of the Vertex buffer interface, so the buffer would be coming after the fuzz and or impedance-sensitive devices, and then would go through the same sequence of pedals, the tuner, the overdrive, the boost, the chorus, and then you would feed the delay and reverb, and then you could go mono or stereo out from there. depending on what you were going to be using. I'm not going to detail as much on the output section because we've done that several times and we really just want to focus on that impedance-sensitive section. The other way you could do it if you weren't planning to use an audition loop or you weren't planning to use any sort of amp with an effects loop is you could plug the guitar into the send because that's passive and it's TS or TRS, but in this case, just using it as a TS as a mono connection. Guitar would plug into send. Send would go into the input of your impedance-sensitive devices. The output of the impedance-sensitive devices would feed the guitar input on the buffer interface, and then the output would feed the subsequent pedals, the tuner, the overdrive, the boost, the chorus, delay, reverb, etc. And so basically, it's just a matter of whether you want to plug into the impedance-sensitive devices first because you want access to the effects loop into those stereo outputs, or if you don't need that and you can just plug straight into the send. Again, the only consequence of going into the send is you just won't have access to that audition loop or an effects loop if you needed that for your amps or to wire some external pedals off of the pedal board. Two other things I wanted to mention about what the Vertex buffer interface does, the first of which is, again, that send is basically a multi-purpose jack. I know it says send on the box, but it can be anything that you need it to be. It is passive and it is TRS. So that means that you can use it as an input or an output. Either side will function either way because it is just a pass-through. It can be a pass-through for MIDI. It can be a pass-through for an amplifier foot switch if you have something that you want to put on the pedal board and run it back to your amplifier in order to facilitate channel switching. Or if you have a switcher and you want to run that so the switcher is able to do channel switching for the amplifier, or you want to have some sort of off-board expression pedal, it can function as a pass-through for all that. So as I said, extremely versatile and multi-purpose. And again, that's the only jack on the entire thing that's passive, so it can really be used however you need it to be used in order to make it work for your signal path. The other sort of bonus thing that the Vertex buffer interface can do is you can use a tuner out on it. And the way that you do that or create the tuner out is by using a Y cable from the output. So in other words, the guitar plugs into the input of the buffer interface. On that output, the buffer is so high quality that we can split it and still not get any signal loss. But in order to split it, you need to use a Y cable. And this is different than an insert cable like what you saw when we were talking about the stereo audition loop. This is a mono connection that splits out to two mono connections. So it is all mono. This is just a splitter cable. You can either make one by just using a regular guitar cable and fusing those two ends from two different guitar cables into one plug that's all mono. I'll also show you an example of one that you can buy readily made from Hosa that will do it for you. One side of this is going to feed the input of the tuner because, again, for a tuner out, you don't need to use the output of the tuner, just the input. And then the other side will just feed the signal path from there. Just, the overdrive, the boost, the chorus, the reverbs, delays, etc. Again, this will not affect the signal path whatsoever. There is no parallel loading here as a consequence of the fact that you're doing a split output. The quality of these buffers are so high that you could be running 50 foot in each of those sides of the Y cable and it still wouldn't make one bit of difference in terms of the impact on the tone. So that was a rundown of all the different ways that you can utilize the Vertex buffer interface. Again, there's a QR code that is engraved in every single one of our buffer interfaces that you can scan with your phone at any time, and it will take you to a real-time list of all the various ways that you can use the interface. We are constantly updating it with user-submitted guides, things that you guys have done that we didn't even consider that would be great ways to wire it, in addition to what we know to be ways that it works and the standard practices for all the major ways of wiring it. If you're interested in checking this out, please do check the description. All the major retailers that are selling this product are listed there, both nationally within the US and internationally, so you can check one out, pick one up, and put one into your board. And of course, if you have comments or questions, you can always put that down in the comments section, or you can send us an email and we would be happy to help you figure out exactly how to wire your rig. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella, and we'll see you on the next video.